It was in Paris on a warm September night in the year 1920 that a strange silence seemed to settle upon a grand hotel by the banks of the Seine. In one of its softly lit rooms, a woman lay pale and still, the faint scent of chemicals lingering in the air, while footsteps rushed down corridors muffled by thick carpets. Outside, the city of light continued its laughter, carriages rattled along the cobblestones, and music poured from cafe doors. Yet within those walls, time appeared to hesitate, as though unwilling to move forward into the inevitable. Good evening, dear listener. You and I are about to wander through the life of Olive Thomas, the dazzling star of silent film and Broadway spectacle, whose brief existence left behind not only admiration and scandal, but whispers of haunting that echo even now. Before we begin, I invite you to share, in the quiet chamber of memory, where and when you are listening to this tale. Add your voice to the network of those who keep history alive. And if you feel the wish to support this channel of timeless history documents, do press the subscribe button, for such gestures help preserve the threads of remembrance. From the quiet hush of the Parisian hotel, we drift back through time, as if retracing steps down a long corridor, each lamp growing dimmer, until we arrive at the coal-smudged horizon of Pennsylvania in the year 1894. It was there, in the small mill town of Charleroi, that Oliva R. Duffy first opened her eyes. The world she entered was not one of velvet curtains and chandeliers, but of modest homes pressed close together, where the air carried the faint sting of smoke and iron dust. The Monongahela River curved nearby, its surface often rippling with the shadows of barges and the shimmer of factory flames that licked the evening sky. Her father, James, worked within the wearying embrace of industry, while her mother, Rena, tended to children and household with a patience worn thin by the endless demands of survival. Olive was the eldest of what would become several children, and as in so many working families, each birth was both joy and burden. There is a kind of music that plays in such homes, a rhythm of footsteps, of creaking boards, of whispered prayers before meals. One imagines that young Olive, with wide eyes and a curious spirit, learned early how fragile security could be, and how easily beauty might become the only currency that offered escape. When the dusk came upon Charleroi, the lamps would glow faintly against the gray, and children would linger by the windows, gazing toward streets where carriages passed, where the world seemed wider and more mysterious. In such evenings, perhaps Olive felt the first stirrings of yearning, the faint tug of a destiny larger than the narrow alleys of her birthplace. Yet fate can be cruel in its lessons. When Olive was still a young girl, her father suffered an accident and died, leaving the family without its provider. Death in those times did not come shrouded in ceremony, but arrived like a sudden shadow, altering the rhythm of every day that followed. The loss of James Duffy pushed the family into deeper struggle, and Olive, barely out of childhood, was thrust toward responsibility. Her mother moved them to McKee's Rocks, closer to relatives and opportunities, yet survival remained uncertain. It is said that early loss sharpens the imagination, for children who watch their parents vanish into silence often learn to dream in order to endure. Did Olive, walking to church on Sunday mornings in her best but simplest dress, already feel a restless fire within her? Did she sense that her life would not remain bounded by these narrow streets? The answers are lost to time, but the questions linger. For we know she carried within her something luminous, something that others could not help but notice. At school, she was bright enough, though her future was never destined for books or long studies. Instead, she found work as a clerk in a department store, standing long hours amid the fabrics and perfumes that hinted at another world. The feel of silk beneath her fingers, the faint shimmer of satins displayed in windows, may have planted further seeds of longing. Customers who came and went must have seen in her face not merely a salesgirl, but a figure who carried an air of possibility, an almost theatrical presence. In those years, the young woman still bore the name Oliva Duffy. It was not yet softened into the stage-worthy Olive Thomas, nor lit by the silver glow of film projectors. She was only a girl helping her family survive, her wages too small, her days too long, her evenings filled with sighs. But there was also within her a secret knowledge that beauty, charm, and will could open doors closed to so many. If one listens closely, one can almost hear her footsteps along the aisles of that shop, the brushing sound of fabric as her hand lingered over it, the faint hum of a tune she might have carried within herself. Outside, the streets of Pittsburgh bustled with workers, with horse-drawn wagons, with the hiss of rail lines carrying steel to distant places. Yet Olive's gaze often drifted upward toward the city's grand theaters, whose posters promise song and spectacle. How many dreams have been born from such silent moments when a young girl touches a bolt of silk and wonders how it would feel to wear it, not as merchandise but as costume? How many destinies begin with a glance out of a shop window, a heart aching for more than wages and routine? Time, like a river, carried her forward. She would not remain forever in McKee's Rocks, nor bound to the life of a shopgirl, for there are certain spirits whom life itself seems to select, lifting them from obscurity and setting them, however briefly, in the light of attention, and Olive was among them. But for now, as we leave her in that department store, her hand still brushing across the shimmering fabrics, the air heavy with the mingled scents of leather and perfume, we sense her restlessness pressing against the narrow frame of her world. The image lingers, a young girl, not yet 20, her face turned toward the window, watching as twilight falls upon a city of smoke and iron, her eyes lit by something that even she may not fully understand. Her hand still rests on the silk, the faint shimmer gliding beneath her fingertips, when we feel the years begin to shift around her, as though time itself cannot bear to keep her waiting too long. The shop where she worked was but a temporary stage, and beyond its doors, another path awaited. By 1914, when Olive was nearing 20 years of age, the world outside had grown louder, more hurried, filled with a sense that a new century was calling for change. Automobiles rattled through the streets, their engines coughing against the old rhythm of horse hooves. The newspapers spoke of conflict in Europe, a war that seemed distant yet ominous. And in the midst of this unsettled air, Olive made a decision that would alter her life forever. It began with something seemingly small, a contest. Beauty contests in those days were not yet the great televised pageants of later generations. They were community spectacles, part exhibition, part curiosity, often organized by department stores or theaters seeking attention. Yet in them lay the promise of transformation. Olive entered one such contest, and in doing so, stepped quietly out of the shadows of obscurity. Her photograph, submitted among many, captured a face luminous in its youth and certainty. When she was announced as the winner, it was more than a ribbon or a crown. It was a sign, subtle yet undeniable, that her life could no longer remain within the narrow walls of McKee's Rocks. How must she have felt that evening when her name was read aloud? Did she glance toward her family, embarrassed by the applause, or did she feel within her chest the first rush of triumph? The truth has been softened by time, but one imagines her cheeks warmed, her eyes downcast, and within her a new fire sparking. For beauty, when recognized by others, becomes both shield and weapon. The prize of this contest was not mere flattery. It brought with it an introduction to possibilities in New York City, that vast hive of lights and ambition where countless young women dreamed of standing on stage. Olive, bold in her decision, left Pennsylvania behind and ventured eastward. The journey itself must have been overwhelming, the clatter of trains carrying her through towns and fields, the gradual rise of anticipation as the skyline of Manhattan came into view, towering in its modern defiance of heaven. New York in 1914 was unlike any place she had known. The air smelled of coal smoke and perfume, roasted chestnuts and sea brine. The streets overflowed with carriages, bicycles, automobiles, newsboys shouting headlines, and women in long skirts moving quickly between errands. Above them all hung the glitter of marquees, promising song and laughter, escape and wonder. To a young girl from Charleroi, it must have seemed like stepping into another world entirely. Olive found her way into the orbit of artists, photographers, and impresarios. Among them, Florence Ziegfeld reigned supreme, known for his spectacular theatrical revues, the Ziegfeld Follies. These performances blended music, dance, and extravagant costumes into living tableaus of fantasy. Ziegfeld sought not merely dancers, but living symbols of beauty itself, women who could embody elegance and allure with a glance. And soon, Olive would become one of them. But before that, she walked the quieter path of adaptation. She learned how to hold herself differently, how to move with poise, how to soften her Pittsburgh accent into something less provincial. In rented rooms with bare walls, she studied her reflection in cracked mirrors, practicing expressions that conveyed mischief or mystery. The city outside roared with energy, but within those small rooms she was crafting an identity, layer by layer, like a painter brushing over an early sketch. At night she must have felt the tug of homesickness, the thought of her mother and siblings, the warmth of a kitchen far removed from the brilliance of Broadway. Yet she pressed forward, certain that her chance lay not behind her, but ahead, within the very heart of the city that never slept. In time, she was chosen by Ziegfeld himself to join the chorus of his follies. To stand beneath the blazing lights, adorned in feathers and silk, her face powdered, her lips painted, was to step into a world most could only imagine. The applause that rose from the audience was a tide of affirmation, washing away the soot of Pennsylvania mills and the long hours of clerking in shops. She was now part of something grand, something dazzling. And yet, behind the stage, there remained the hum of uncertainty. The other girls whispered, rivalries formed, and the pressure to maintain beauty and charm was constant. Ziegfeld girls were admired but also gossiped about, their reputations as fragile as glass. Olive, with her natural brightness, drew attention easily, but attention was both gift and peril. In those moments when the costumes were set aside, when the grease paint was washed from her face, perhaps she felt again the weight of who she had been. For the journey from Oliva Duffy to Olive Thomas was not simply one of name, but of identity itself. She was becoming a creation, part herself, part invention, and still she longed for more. The stage was intoxicating, yet the moving pictures, those flickering shadows on the silver screen, were beginning to capture the imagination of the world. Silent films had grown from curiosities to full stories. Their stars celebrated as new royalty. Olive watched these developments with hungry eyes, aware that here lay the next step of her ascent. But the city was not without danger. The same lights that illuminated also burned, and many who sought fame found only ruin. To live in New York as a young woman in 1914 was to walk a narrow path, balancing opportunity and peril with each step. Olive knew this, and yet she walked forward, fearless. And so, we leave her for now. Standing backstage at the new Amsterdam Theatre, costumes shimmering, the orchestra beginning to play, the audience murmuring in anticipation, she stands with her fellow performers, but her eyes are lifted, as if already searching beyond this moment, towards something even greater. The image remains, a young woman, once a shopgirl, now a Ziegfeld girl, standing in the glow of stage lights, a single feather drifting from her headdress, turning slowly as it falls into the shadows. The feather turns in the air, light as breath, until it touches the dark floorboards of the stage. For a moment it lies there unnoticed, a fragment of costume fallen away, as the music swells and the curtains rise. Olive steps forward into the blaze of light, her smile prepared, her movements timed to the rhythm of the orchestra, her body itself becoming part of a living painting meant to dazzle the eyes of strangers. The audience, eager and restless, greets her with a murmur of appreciation, and in that moment her life changes, though she herself may not yet know it. The Ziegfeld Follies were not merely performances. They were spectacles of excess, dreamscapes fashioned for a society hungry for beauty, for distraction, for the shimmer of unreality. To be chosen as one of Ziegfeld's girls was to be elevated into a rarefied circle, where glamour cloaked ambition and every glance carried meaning. Olive, with her luminous eyes and playful grace, fit easily into this new mythology. Yet behind the glitter, there was another truth, quieter, harder to grasp. Night after night she performed beneath the chandeliers, her body adorned with sequins, feathers, and jewels that sparkled under the gaslights. She became an emblem, a symbol of the Follies' promise that beauty could conquer sorrow, that spectacle could silence the weary noise of the world outside. But when the final applause faded and the stage grew dark, Olive would return to her small dressing room where the mirror showed not the goddess of the performance, but a young woman washing paint from her skin, rubbing tired feet, folding her costume carefully as if to preserve the illusion for another night. It is often said that the Follies created stars, but they also consumed them. For every girl who ascended into recognition, many more faded into obscurity, their names forgotten even as the show carried on. Olive understood this fragility. She knew that beauty was not eternal, that youth slipped away more quickly than applause. Perhaps it was this awareness that made her gaze so sharp, her laughter edged with something unspoken. The city, too, began to recognize her. Newspapers wrote of the Ziegfeld girls as if they were royalty. Their photographs circulated like treasures. Men of means sought their company, some offering gifts, others promises that dissolved with morning light. Olive walked through this world with a mixture of wonder and caution, learning how to protect herself even as she welcomed its pleasures. There were whispers of parties that lasted until dawn, of champagne flowing like rivers, of friendships that blurred into rivalries. In such company, Olive's star began to shine, though each new admirer brought with them both opportunity and risk. One cannot help but ask, did she feel joy in those evenings, when laughter echoed in smoke-filled rooms and music played from gramophones until the stylus wore thin? Or did she, even then, feel the faint loneliness of someone whose beauty sets her apart, admired but rarely known? History does not give us her thoughts, only fragments, only the photographs that show her smiling yet mysterious, as though she guarded her truest self behind a veil. It was during these years that she began to transform her name, leaving behind Oliva Duffy and embracing Olive Thomas. The change was subtle, yet profound. Names, after all, are both shields and invitations. To become Olive Thomas was to step fully into the role of performer, to shed the soot-stained past and claim a new identity in the realm of glamour. It is difficult to say how conscious this transformation was, yet it marked the beginning of her ascent toward wider fame. But life, with its twists, never allows a single path to remain straight. Olive had married young, to a man named Bernard Krug Thomas, a union that would soon dissolve in annulment. The marriage had been brief, a shadow of convention more than a true partnership. By the time she embraced her new name, Olive was already free from that bond, though the traces of it lingered in the surname she chose to keep. It was as if she carried forward the memory of a failed attempt at stability, wearing it like an ornament even as she sought freedom. Amid the shifting currents of the city, Olive continued to rise. Artists painted her. Photographers captured her face in portraits that revealed both innocence and mischief. She was not merely beautiful, she was magnetic. When she entered a room, eyes turned. When she smiled, conversations paused. The Ziegfeld girls were many, but Olive possessed something that could not be taught, a presence that drew others without effort. And yet how fragile such presence can be. For every admirer there was also the weight of scrutiny. Women like Olive were celebrated, but also judged. Their choices dissected in gossip columns, their reputations balanced precariously on the whispers of strangers. She must have felt this pressure, even as she laughed and played her part. Perhaps she wore her defiance as lightly as her feathers, knowing that her life was already destined to be brief in its innocence. In those evenings, after the music faded, she would sometimes walk alone through the streets of New York. The city glowed with electric lights, shop windows glittered with wares, and the river reflected the shimmer of bridges and towers. For a girl who had once stood in a Pennsylvania shop, touching bolts of fabric and dreaming of another life, this must have seemed a kind of magic. But magic always carries with it an undertone of melancholy, for it cannot last forever. As we linger with her in these years, the image sharpens. Olive standing in her dressing room, costume hanging from its hook, her hands resting lightly on the vanity table. A single feather lies beside her, fallen from her headdress, its soft curve catching the faint glow of the mirror's bulbs. She looks at it with a half-smile, aware that even beauty's ornaments are destined to fall. The moment remains suspended, as if time itself hesitates. Outside the theater, carriages rattle by, the city surges with energy, but within this quiet room, Olive lingers between two worlds, the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. The feather still rests upon the vanity, delicate and curved, as Olive leans closer to the mirror. The reflection shows not the radiant figure who moments earlier had commanded the stage, but a young woman with dampened skin, tired eyes, and the faintest trace of vulnerability. She brushes powder from her cheeks, wipes rouge from her lips, and for an instant she is simply Olive again, no longer a vision spun from sequins and light, but a soul caught between the world of dreams and the weight of reality. Yet even in that stripped-down moment, the air seems to hum with a kind of expectancy, as though the city itself knew she was meant for more than chorus lines and fleeting applause. For the Ziegfeld Follies were not only spectacles, they were crucibles, testing each performer's ability to endure the unrelenting gaze of the public. The long rehearsals, the rivalry of fellow dancers, the constant need to be not just beautiful, but captivating. It was a life that demanded both resilience and charm. Many wilted under the pressure, yet Olive seemed to thrive. She carried herself with a lightness, a playful humor that drew others to her side. It was said that even backstage, where tempers often flared, her presence could soften the edges, her laughter rippling like cool water across heated stone. The glamour of the Follies became part of her being. She learned how to glide beneath chandeliers as though born to them, how to wear gowns heavy with jewels as if they weighed nothing at all. Photographers adored her, their cameras catching the tilt of her head, the sparkle in her eyes, the mischievous curl of her lips. Soon her image appeared in newspapers, in illustrated magazines, and on postcards sold to admiring strangers. To see one's own likeness displayed so publicly must have been dizzying, especially for a girl who had once stood behind a counter in a shop, earning wages counted carefully at week's end. And yet, she remained restless. The stage was vast, but it was not limitless. Each night she repeated the same steps, the same gestures, the same choreographed dreams. Perhaps in those hours she felt both the intoxication of applause and the emptiness of routine. She was praised, yes, but she was one among many, a bright jewel set into a crown already heavy with sparkle. Olive wanted more. It was then that the moving pictures beckoned. Silent film was still a young art, but it was growing swiftly, spreading across America like wildfire. Audiences marveled at the flickering stories that seemed to breathe life into shadows. The stars of this new medium were celebrated in ways that rivaled kings and queens of old. And Olive, watching the silver screen, must have felt the tug of destiny once more. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was more than that. She possessed an energy, a kind of mischievous light that translated perfectly to film, where words were absent and every glance, every gesture, carried meaning. By 1916, opportunities had begun to circle around her. Producers who attended the Follies took note of her charm, whispering of contracts, of screen tests, of a chance to trade the boards of Broadway for the wide embrace of cinema. To Olive, the choice must have felt inevitable. The stage had lifted her from obscurity, but film promised immortality. Still, the decision carried risk. Not every stage star adapted to the screen, where gestures had to be larger yet subtler, where the absence of spoken dialogue forced every emotion into the language of the eyes. But Olive possessed that rare ability to inhabit silence, to let her gaze linger a moment too long, to allow mischief to flicker across her lips without a word spoken. She seemed to belong to film before she ever set foot before a camera. Around this time, whispers of her personal life began to weave themselves into her public story. She was admired by many, courted by wealthy men, and sometimes the gossip columns hinted at liaisons, at nights of champagne and laughter. Yet beneath the surface lay a more complex truth. She was a woman navigating a world where beauty could open doors but also ensnare, where admiration could turn to possession, and where every choice carried echoes in the press. Olive learned quickly how to wear charm as armor, smiling even as she shielded herself from intrusion. Florenz Ziegfeld himself admired her, though some said he also grew wary of her independence. For Olive was not content to play the role assigned to her. She wanted to shape her own destiny. The Follies had given her a stage, but she would not remain a figure in someone else's design. She was preparing to step out, to seize her own spotlight. One can imagine her walking home from the theater on a cool night, the streets of New York alive with energy, her footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. Above her, the electric signs of Broadway glowed, their bulbs buzzing faintly, their letters proclaiming names both famous and forgotten. Did she, gazing upward, wonder if her own name would one day blaze among them? Did she already sense that her face, her spirit, would soon be captured on film, projected larger than life to audiences who would never meet her yet, feel as though they knew her? The line between dream and reality blurred for her in those years. On stage, she wore gowns stitched with jewels. Off stage, she walked the same crowded streets as shopgirls and clerks, her presence hidden beneath a simple coat and hat. But inside, she carried the knowledge that she was no longer ordinary. She was chosen, lifted, called to something greater. And so the feather on the vanity, once a mere fragment of costume, becomes a symbol of her transformation. For Olive, each performance was both triumph and departure, a step away from the anonymity of the chorus and toward the singular destiny of stardom. She gathered her courage, her charm, her restless ambition, and prepared to cross once more into the unknown. The moment lingers, Olive closing the door of her dressing room, the feather still lying forgotten on the vanity. Outside, the city hums with expectation, and somewhere in the distance a projector begins to whir, casting flickering light against a blank screen as though waiting for her arrival. The feather lies upon the vanity, left behind in the hush of the dressing room as Olive steps into the night air. The city is alive with its usual pulse, streetcars clanging, voices carrying up from sidewalks, the faint scent of roasted chestnuts mingling with coal smoke. But she moves through it with a quiet determination, as if she has already left this chapter behind. The theater may still echo with the applause of strangers, yet in Olive's mind another stage is forming, larger, stranger, and filled not with live audiences, but with the silent gaze of cameras. It was in this moment of transition that her name became more than an accident of circumstance. Oliva Duffy, the the girl of Pennsylvania, had already shed one identity when she became Olive Thomas during her brief marriage. But now the name hardened into permanence, a banner beneath which she would enter the new world of moving pictures. Names are peculiar things. They shape destinies as much as they disguise origins. In calling herself Olive Thomas, she was at once preserving a fragment of her past and refashioning it into something glamorous, something that could gleam in print without the weight of soot or sorrow. Her earliest film ventures came through Triangle Pictures, and like many performers making the leap from stage to screen, she began with modest roles. The world of cinema was at that time both exhilarating and uncertain, a frontier where conventions were still being invented. Films were short, often melodramatic, filled with broad gestures meant to carry meaning without words. Yet Olive seemed born for it. Where others exaggerated, she let her expressions play in subtler registers. The tilt of her head, the mischief in her eyes, the sudden curve of her lips. Audiences noticed, directors noticed. She was not simply another chorus girl preserved on film. She was something alive, vivid, and natural before the lens. But as with the stage, the film world carried its own hungers. The industry was young and unregulated, and reputations could be tarnished as quickly as they were made. Olive navigated it with a mixture of innocence and cunning, understanding that the image projected upon the screen was both hers and not hers. The girl from McKee's Rocks had not vanished. She lived still in Olive's memories, in her longing for security and belonging. Yet the new Olive, the actress, the star in the making, was a creation designed to be consumed. Did she ever feel the strangeness of that dual existence, caught between the self she carried within and the figure the world demanded she become? It was also in these years that her personal life grew more complicated. Freed from her first marriage, she was once again surrounded by admirers, men with wealth, influence, or the simple intoxication of desire. Some offered her companionship, some the glitter of promise. But Olive's independence remained central. She was not a girl to be easily claimed, and yet the whispers of scandal followed her. In New York, in Hollywood, and in the society pages, her name carried the sparkle of intrigue. To some, this was dangerous. To others, irresistible. What is it about beauty that unsettles as much as it enchants? Perhaps it is the knowledge that it can be wielded like a weapon, opening doors or closing them with equal ease. Olive, though still young, seemed to understand this power. She smiled when she chose to, withheld it when she preferred silence. Those who mistook her laughter for submission quickly discovered her spirit was not so easily bent. And still, the camera adored her. With each new role, she grew more comfortable in the strange, wordless language of cinema. Her movements were light, her glances playful, her energy contagious. She was becoming something new for audiences, not the distant goddess of the screen, but the mischievous companion, the carefree spirit who danced through the jazz age with a wink. She embodied a new type of heroine, one who laughed at conventions, who dared to play rather than only to pose. Yet at night, in the quiet hours when the studio lights were extinguished and the streets grew empty, she must have wondered who Olive Thomas truly was. Was she the Pennsylvania girl who once pressed fabric between her fingers in a department store, dreaming of silk gowns? Was she the Ziegfeld Girl who danced beneath chandeliers, her face powdered and painted into brilliance? Or was she now something else entirely, a figure flickering in the darkened theaters of America, adored by thousands who would never know the sound of her voice? The question lingers even as her career gathers momentum, for behind every photograph and every moving image lies the mystery of identity, the tension between truth and invention. Olive carried that tension with elegance, but it could not have been easy. To wear a mask so often is to risk forgetting the face beneath it. One evening, after a day of filming, she might have returned to her room, weary and exhilarated in equal measure. On her table lay a magazine with her portrait, her smile captured in ink for strangers to admire. She studied it, perhaps, with a curious detachment. The woman on the page was herself, yet also not herself. She was at once Olive and not Olive, the girl and the mask, the dream and the shadow. And so, we leave her there, the magazine still open upon the table, her reflection in the window merging with the printed image beside her. Outside, the city hums with restless energy, but inside the room, silence gathers, as though waiting for her to decide which self she will carry forward. The image remains, Olive gazing at her own likeness on the page, a smile both familiar and strange, the room filled with the faint scent of ink and the muffled sounds of the street below. The magazine lies open on the table, its ink still smelling faintly of the press, and Olive's reflection in the window leans toward it, as if she were studying not merely her own face, but the enigma of identity itself. The likeness on the page smiles back with a brightness that seems almost untouchable, yet Olive, in the dim light of her room, feels the weight of fatigue upon her eyelids. Between the woman she sees in the mirror and the figure printed for strangers lies the unspoken distance of invention, and in that space a strange question forms. Which is more enduring, the self that breathes or the image that lingers long after breath has passed? Such questions must have pressed upon her in those years when her life began to shift from the boards of the stage into the flickering world of the silver screen. Triangle Pictures offered her a stage unlike any other, a place where gestures could be captured, repeated, and projected to audiences far beyond the theater district of New York. Silent film had grown from novelty into art, and Olive, stepping before the camera for the first time, discovered a new kind of intimacy. The lens was merciless. It saw everything, yet it also held the power to transform. Unlike the stage, where distance separated performer from audience, the screen magnified every glance, every smile, until strangers felt they had been invited into a private world. Olive's earliest films were brief, light, often playful, comedies and melodramas that relied on broad strokes. Yet within them, her charm shone. She possessed that elusive quality of seeming alive, even in silence, her eyes carrying meaning without need of words. Where others exaggerated, she gave nuance. Where others posed, she moved with spontaneity. The critics took notice. The studios, always hungry for stars who could draw crowds, saw in her not only beauty but vitality. Still, the process of filming was far from glamorous. Long hours under hot lights, costumes heavy and uncomfortable, directors impatient, scripts hastily written. Olive endured it with a resilience born of her years on the stage. She laughed easily, joked with crew, and seemed to carry a brightness that made even the tedious hours of retakes less burdensome. And when the reels were cut, spliced, and sent into theaters, audiences responded with enthusiasm. Letters poured in, asking for her autograph, requesting more films. She was no longer simply one of Ziegfeld's many jewels. She was becoming a star in her own right. Yet fame, like the cinema itself, is a trick of light and shadow. As her films reached wider audiences, so too did the whispers grow louder. Gossip columns speculated about her personal life, about suitors, about the parties she attended. To some, she was a symbol of the new woman, bold, carefree, embodying the playful spirit that would soon be called flapperdom. To others, she was scandalous, too modern, too willing to flaunt convention. Olive, for her part, seemed unconcerned. She embraced the freedom the city offered, dancing at late-night gatherings, laughing in smoke-filled rooms, wearing fashions that hinted at rebellion against the old order. The camera adored her, but perhaps more importantly, audiences recognized something of themselves in her. She was not the remote goddess of earlier screen heroines, nor the tragic damsel of melodrama. She was mischievous, spirited, willing to poke fun at propriety. In her, the younger generation saw the possibility of joy without apology. And so Olive became, even before the word had fully taken root, one of the earliest screen flappers, a figure of liberation cloaked in laughter. But as she moved deeper into cinema, the paradox of film grew sharper. To act before the lens was to surrender to its gaze, to allow oneself to be both revealed and concealed. The image projected on the screen was hers, yet not hers. It carried her features, her gestures, her laughter, but it also belonged to the audience, who interpreted and imagined as they wished. Film, she must have realized, is not a mirror but a prism, bending truth into 1,000 variations. On certain evenings after a day's filming, she may have sat once more by her window, the city's lights flickering across her face, pondering the strange alchemy of this new art. Did the camera capture her essence, or only a shadow of it? Did the laughter she gave so freely belong to her, or had it already been taken, stored in reels to be replayed long after she had forgotten the moment? Such reflections would drift through her mind like smoke, never fully answered, yet always present. The world outside was changing too. The Great War had ended, and society teetered between grief and celebration. The 1920s, with their restless energy, were dawning. Jazz poured from gramophones, women bobbed their hair, and prohibition gave birth to secret nights of revelry. Olive, with her youthful daring, seemed to belong to this age before it had even begun. She danced as though rules were suggestions, laughed as though sorrow could be silenced, and looked into the camera with eyes that promised mischief. And yet, behind the vitality, a quieter truth lingered. For Olive was still young, still searching, still vulnerable to the forces that swirled around her. The same industry that praised her could just as easily discard her. The same public that adored her could turn at the hint of scandal. Perhaps she knew this. Perhaps she felt it in the late hours when the parties ended and the rooms grew still. Fame, she must have realized, is as fragile as a reel of film, brilliant when projected but easily torn, easily lost to fire or neglect. Still, she pressed forward, embracing each new role, each opportunity to carve her place in the shimmering world of cinema. Her laughter, her charm, her boldness, these became her signature, setting her apart in an industry crowded with beauty. She was Olive Thomas, no longer a name scribbled in a contest entry, no longer one of many in a chorus line. She was a star, and the light of her image flickered in theaters across the nation. The magazine remains on the table, open to her portrait, but now the image feels different. It is no longer simply a likeness for strangers. It is the seed of a legend, an emblem of a woman who was both real and imagined. Olive gazes at it one last time, then closes the pages softly, as if sealing away a fragment of herself for others to discover. And so the room grows quiet. Outside, a projector hums somewhere in the city, casting her face upon a screen for unseen crowds. The glow of that projection seems to spill faintly into her window, merging with the dim light of her lamp. The air shimmers with the mingling of reality and illusion, as though the boundary between the two had already begun to dissolve. The shimmer of the projected light lingers in the room, as if her very image had seeped from the theater reels into the quiet of her own world. It is a glow both fragile and persistent, half real, half illusion, and Olive sits within it, caught between the woman she knows herself to be and the figure she has become for strangers. When she steps into the studio the following morning, that light follows her, invisible but present, hovering over her as she rehearses gestures, tilts her head, lets her laughter ripple through the silence. The camera watches, unblinking, and once again it gathers her into its memory. By the late 1910s, her name was spreading beyond New York, carried by film reels to cities and towns far from the stages of Broadway. In small theaters where piano accompaniment trembled against worn floorboards, audiences leaned forward as Olive appeared upon the screen. They saw in her not a distant goddess, but something closer, more human. A girl who laughed with a sparkle in her eyes, who dared to be playful, even mischievous, even defiant. The screen had known tragic heroines, noble mothers, lofty beauties, but Olive brought with her something new. She was carefree without apology, joyous without restraint. She was the figure who hinted at the dawn of a new age, a woman unbound by old conventions. The newspapers began to call her a flapper, though the word itself was still young, not yet fully shaped by the jazz age. A flapper was a girl who bobbed her hair, shortened her skirts, spoke her mind, and danced as though no one were watching. Olive embodied that spirit on screen long before it became a social archetype. She was not rebelling with speeches or manifestos, but with laughter, with the tilt of her chin, with a boldness that suggested women could step outside the narrow lines drawn for them. Audiences adored her for it. To young women, she offered permission to be daring, to embrace fun without shame. To young men, she was irresistible, a spark of energy in a world too often weighed by solemnity. And to the studios, she was gold, a face that drew crowds, a spirit that promised profits. Yet beyond the adoration lay something subtler. Olive had become a symbol. The culture itself, restless in the aftermath of war, hungry for release, seemed to pour its energy into her, choosing her as one of its faces. But what does it mean to be chosen in such a way? To become a symbol is to be lifted, yes, but also to be burdened. For a symbol belongs less to the self than to the world that claims it. Olive's playful screen persona may have mirrored aspects of her true nature, yet it also exaggerated them, demanding that she remain eternally light, eternally daring, eternally young. Off-screen, she carried the weight of fatigue, of personal entanglements, of uncertainties that no audience could see. But once the lights dimmed and the reels spun, she was forever the flapper, forever carefree. The years around 1918 and 1919 saw her in films that solidified this persona. She played the charming troublemaker, the mischievous girl whose laughter unsettled staid propriety. Audiences left the theater humming with delight, speaking of her as though she were someone they had met, someone they might encounter in a cafe or at a dance. The intimacy of silent film created this illusion, collapsing distance until strangers felt they truly knew her. And yet, she remained elusive. For even as Olive was projected across America, the real woman walked quietly through studios, adjusting costumes, conferring with directors, enduring long days beneath hot lamps. She lived within the machinery of a new industry that cared less for her inner life than for the smile she could offer on cue. Did she ever resent it? Did she ever long for roles that showed more depth, more seriousness? Or was she content to let the tide carry her, enjoying the pleasures of fame while it lasted? The truth lies hidden, like a reel misplaced in an archive, perhaps lost forever. At night, when the day's filming ended, Olive often joined the whirl of social life that surrounded the industry. Parties spilled across New York and Los Angeles, filled with laughter, smoke, and music. The jazz rhythms that would define a decade were beginning to stir, syncopated beats echoing through crowded rooms. Olive thrived in such company, yet these nights also deepened the whispers that clung to her. For a woman of her independence, every laugh, every glass lifted, every companion invited speculation. To some, she was reckless. To others, free-spirited. To herself, she may have simply been alive, unwilling to shrink her existence into propriety's narrow frame. The paradox deepened. On screen, she represented a dream, but off-screen she lived in shadows of rumor. And perhaps she accepted this, knowing that the two were inseparable. Fame is not a single flame, but a double one, burning with admiration and gossip at once. To bask in its light is to accept its heat. Still, there must have been moments of quiet. In a dressing room after a long shoot, Olive would remove her costume, loosen her hair, and sit by the mirror in silence. The clamor of the studio faded, replaced by the small sound of fabric slipping from her shoulders. In the mirror, she saw not the flapper of the screen, but the woman herself, young, weary, thoughtful? Did she ever whisper to that reflection, asking whether the world truly knew her? Did she smile at the thought that she had become both herself and not herself, an image woven into the fabric of an era? The films she made in these years did more than entertain. They helped define what it meant to be modern. Olive's screen presence carried forward the idea that joy itself could be an act of defiance, that a laugh could unsettle centuries of solemn tradition. She embodied the uncertainty and the freedom of a generation, stepping out of war and into a new rhythm. And so the shimmer of projection grows brighter. Audiences across the country sit in darkened theaters, their faces lit by the flicker of reels, their hearts caught by the image of a woman who seems to belong both to them and to some realm beyond reach. Olive's laughter fills the silence, echoing through smoky auditoriums, echoing through time itself. The image lingers, a reel of film slipping loose from its canister, the strip of celluloid spilling softly across the floor, its frames glowing faintly as they catch the light, each tiny square preserving a gesture, a smile, a spark of life that will outlast the moment. The strip of celluloid lies across the floor, its frames glowing faintly in the scattered light, each square a preserved gesture, a moment of laughter, a smile forever unchanging. Yet beyond the stillness of the reel, Olive's real life moved quickly, filled with currents that pulled her into deeper waters of society, pleasure, and rumor. For if the screen gave her an image to the world also gave back to her temptations and trials, pleasures that glittered like champagne but vanished with dawn. In New York and later in Los Angeles, the film world pulsed with energy long after the studios had gone dark. When cameras ceased whirring and makeup was washed away, the evenings came alive with invitations. Grand hotels, private rooms, clubs veiled against prohibition, where music played and laughter rose against the silence of curfews. Olive was often among these gatherings, her charm and brightness ensuring she was always welcome, always admired. At such parties, the air was thick with smoke and perfume. The pop of corks mingled with jazz from pianos or gramophones. Men in tailored suits leaned close to whisper promises. Women in sequin dresses threw back their heads in laughter. The mood was restless, a generation eager to forget the shadows of war, eager to dance until dawn. And Olive, with her mischievous eyes and ready laughter, seemed the very spirit of that age. She had suitors in abundance, men with money, with influence, with reputations both glittering and notorious. Some offered her jewels, others companionship, some only fleeting amusement. And while she accepted their company with ease, she remained elusive, never quite bound, never fully possessed. This independence, admired by some, unsettled others, for in a world where women were often expected to submit to protection or marriage, Olive moved freely, choosing as she pleased. Yet the newspapers, hungry for stories, embroidered every gesture. A late-night appearance at a restaurant became scandalous. A dance shared with a known socialite was whispered into gossip. Rumors spread like wildfire, growing in the telling. She was painted as reckless, wild, a woman too daring for her own safety. And though she smiled in public, such whispers must have weighed upon her in private. For fame is a double-edged gift. The brighter one shines, the darker the shadows of judgment that gather. Behind the scenes, Olive's circle included fellow actors, dancers, and producers, many of them equally swept up in the whirl of excess. Friendships formed quickly, dissolved suddenly, rekindled again at the next party. To live in those circles was to live in a storm, where loyalty was fragile and pleasure often masked loneliness. Yet Olive carried herself with a lightness that made her seem untouchable, as though laughter could keep sorrow at bay. But no one is untouched. The strain of constant performance, both on and off screen, left its mark. Nights of revelry gave way to mornings of fatigue. Roles demanded more energy, and the pressure of public scrutiny grew ever heavier. In quiet moments, she may have wondered how long she could balance the two selves, the luminous star and the vulnerable woman behind the mask. Her romances, too, deepened the intrigue. She attracted not only admirers but companions of passion, men whose lives were as turbulent as her own. Some of these entanglements burned brightly and vanished. Others lingered, leaving traces in memory and in rumor. To be Olive Thomas was to be desired, and desire always carried with it both sweetness and danger. There is a kind of intoxication in such a life when one is young, admired, and seemingly unbound by consequence. Yet intoxication blurs the line between freedom and peril. Did Olive know she walked such a narrow edge? Did she sense that beneath the champagne bubbles, beneath the laughter and applause, there lurked shadows waiting to catch her? The answer drifts like smoke, uncertain, unresolved. Still, she danced. She laughed. She lived as if time itself were urging her forward, as though she knew her days would not be countless. She wore gowns that shimmered in candlelight, her laughter echoing down staircases of hotels, her presence leaving an afterglow that lingered long after she departed. Friends recalled her as vibrant, playful, filled with mischief. Strangers remembered her face from photographs, her name from whispered stories. She was everywhere, and yet never fully known. And so the reel of her life unwinds further, spilling across the floor, frames flickering with images of parties and embraces, of laughter and scandal. Each frame is both truth and illusion, both memory and invention. The image lingers. A champagne glass overturned on a marble floor, its contents spilling slowly, catching the glint of lamplight, while the music of a distant piano continues, as though nothing has been lost. The champagne spreads across the marble floor, its pale surface catching the glow of lamplight, a tiny river flowing where none was meant to be. Around it, the laughter of the party continues. Feet step carefully to avoid the spill, and music drifts from a nearby piano, a melody that seems to carry joy, but also a trace of melancholy. It is in such moments where brightness and fragility meet that Olive's path turned toward one of the most fateful bonds of her life. Among the many admirers who hovered around her orbit, one stood apart: Jack Pickford, brother of Mary Pickford, the darling of silent film America. Mary was known as America's sweetheart, her image pure and beloved, a figure almost sanctified by the public. Jack was different. Handsome, restless, often reckless, he lived in the shadows of his sister's greatness, burdened by expectation, yet unwilling to surrender his taste for indulgence. Where Mary represented innocence, Jack carried the aura of mischief, and it was perhaps this quality that drew Olive to him. Their meeting has been told in fragments, sometimes in laughter, sometimes with a touch of scandal. What is certain is that Olive, already known for her independence, found in Jack a companion who matched her appetite for life's pleasures. He was charming, unpredictable, and dangerous, the kind of man who made promises with a smile and broke them with another. To some, their union seemed destined for ruin. To others, it was the perfect pairing of two restless spirits. They married in 1916, quietly, away from the bright gaze of Mary's fame and the scrutiny of the press. Olive became part of the Pickford family, though not always welcomed with open arms. The Pickfords were protective of their image, careful to maintain Mary's aura of sweetness, and Olive, with her whispers of scandal, her nights of revelry, did not fit easily into that carefully crafted story. Yet Olive and Jack seemed unconcerned. They had one another, and for a time that bond, turbulent though it was, sustained them. But passion, when bound with instability, often burns too brightly. Their marriage was marked by quarrels as much as by laughter, by separations as much as reunions. Jack's drinking was notorious, his indulgences a source of both amusement and sorrow. Olive, too, was drawn into the whirl of such nights, their lives a constant movement between delight and despair. And yet, beneath it all, there was love, raw and undeniable, though expressed in ways that wounded as often as they healed. The newspapers began to take note. Stories appeared of quarrels, of reconciliations, of parties that stretched long into the dawn. Their names were spoken with both admiration and warning, a couple both celebrated and gossiped about, forever surrounded by whispers of scandal. Olive, once simply admired for her beauty and charm, was now drawn into the web of Pickford fame, her actions magnified, her choices questioned. To be Mrs. Jack Pickford was to live in the glare of scrutiny that never dimmed. Still, they could not remain away from one another for long. Each time quarrels pushed them apart, passion drew them back together. There is a kind of tragic poetry in such unions, where love and ruin are so tightly bound that to escape one is to lose the other. Olive, who had long walked the line between freedom and danger, now found herself tethered to a man who mirrored her own restlessness. Did she ever wonder if another path might have been gentler? Did she imagine in quiet moments what life might have been had she chosen stability over passion? Or was it Jack's very turbulence that made her feel alive, as though she could not exist without the fire he brought into her days? These are questions without answers, lingering like smoke after a candle is extinguished. On evenings when they were reconciled, their love shone bright. They were seen walking arm in arm, laughing as though no quarrel had ever touched them. In such moments, Olive seemed radiant, her spirit lifted by the warmth of companionship. Yet the shadow was never far. Jack's indulgences continued, and the pressures of fame weighed heavily upon them both. Theirs was a marriage lived in the extremes, too passionate to be calm, too volatile to be secure. And so Olive's life grew even more entwined with scandal, her name appearing in columns not only for her films, but for her marriage, her nights out, her reconciliations with Jack. The line between her career and her personal life blurred, each fueling the fascination of the public. She had become not merely an actress, but a figure of intrigue, her every move watched, her every gesture recorded. The image remains. The champagne glass overturned, its contents spreading slowly across the marble, reflecting the glow of lamps. Around it, laughter continues, but in the reflection lies a shadow, the suggestion that joy and sorrow, love and ruin, are never far apart. The champagne glows faintly on the marble floor, its shallow pool mirroring the lamplight like liquid fire, while laughter drifts through the room, careless and unbroken. Beyond the clinking of glasses and the murmur of music, another sound begins to rise elsewhere. A softer rhythm, the whir of film reels turning, capturing images that would outlast any party, any quarrel, any whispered scandal. For Olive's name, so often tied to stories of her personal life, now reached towards something greater, a role that would crystallize her spirit upon the screen and secure her place as one of the earliest symbols of a new age. It was in 1920 that Olive starred in a picture simply titled The Flapper. The word itself, still new to the public's ear, carried the promise of rebellion, of youth unchained from the strictures of its elders. Society was shifting rapidly in the aftermath of war, and women, emboldened by newfound freedoms, were redefining themselves. Hemlines rose, corsets loosened, cigarettes were held between painted lips, and the world trembled on the threshold of the jazz age. Into this landscape stepped Olive, her presence both playful and daring, embodying the very spirit of change. The Flapper told the story of a mischievous schoolgirl, innocent yet restless, caught between the expectations of tradition and the temptations of freedom. Olive played the role with a natural vitality, her expression shifting effortlessly from coy mischief to earnest charm. On screen she danced, laughed, schemed, and stumbled through the uncertainties of youth, yet always with a sparkle that disarmed criticism. The performance was not grandiose, nor was it solemn. It was light, fresh, filled with a kind of breathless joy. Audiences responded with enthusiasm. For many, Olive's portrayal captured precisely what they longed to see. A figure who laughed at convention, who embraced fun without apology, who dared to live as though the future were wide and unbound. The film became a touchstone, and though Olive had already been known as a rising star, this role fixed her identity firmly in the public imagination. She was no longer simply Olive Thomas, the actress. She was the flapper herself, the screen's first embodiment of a new generation's restless energy. Yet even as she sparkled upon the screen, a question whispered beneath the applause. Did she, in her heart, feel that the role reflected her true self, or was it merely another mask, another invention woven for the camera? For Olive's own life, filled with late nights, laughter, and whispers of scandal, seemed to mirror the character she played. But perhaps that was precisely what made the performance so compelling. Audiences sensed that Olive was not pretending, but simply revealing a facet of herself already alive within her. Still, to be the symbol of an age is to be caught in a paradox. The flapper was celebrated as modern and free, yet she was also judged, mocked, dismissed as frivolous. Olive bore that contradiction as she bore so many others. To some, she was the face of liberation. To others, she was reckless, an emblem of excess. And while she laughed and danced before the camera, behind the scenes her life with Jack remained turbulent, her nights filled with both passion and quarrels. The flapper's carefree mask could not silence the complexities of reality. The making of the flapper itself carried its own intensity. Filming demanded long days, endless retakes, the precision of timing without the aid of spoken words. Olive's energy seemed inexhaustible, her charm unforced. Yet when the cameras stopped, fatigue crept in. Did she ever sit quietly in her dressing room, script still in hand, and wonder whether the laughter she poured onto the screen would one day fade into silence? Did she imagine that a single film could secure her legacy, or did she see it merely as another step in a career still unfolding? When the picture premiered, the glow of her image filled theaters across the country. Audiences leaned forward in the dark, watching her eyes flicker mischievously, her smile hint at secrets, her steps dance just beyond convention. They laughed with her, sighed with her, admired her. For those fleeting reels, she belonged to everyone, yet to no one completely. Cinema has always carried that strange enchantment. It gives the illusion of intimacy while preserving distance, allowing the star to be both near and untouchable. And so Olive, who had once pressed fabrics in a department store, who had once danced among the glittering ranks of Ziegfeld's chorus, now stood alone as a figure larger than life, a new archetype. The flapper was no longer merely a word whispered in changing fashion circles. It was a face, a smile, a spirit. And that spirit was Olive's. But even as her star ascended, the shadows grew. The more brightly she shone, the more hungrily the world sought to claim pieces of her. Newspapers printed her name not only in praise but in scandal. Rumors swirled about her marriage, about her nights out, about quarrels and reconciliations. Fame, like champagne, sparkled at first sip but left its bitter aftertaste. And yet, she continued, laughing still, playing still, giving to the screen the lightness that audiences craved. One imagines her on the night of the premiere, standing at the back of a theater, watching herself flicker across the screen. Around her, strangers laughed and applauded, unaware that she stood in their midst. Did she smile with pride? Did she feel the strange chill of watching her own double projected larger than life, knowing that this image would linger even as her real self continued to age, to falter, to live a life unrecorded? Such thoughts might have passed quickly, swallowed by the noise of celebration, yet in the quiet hours afterward they must have returned. The champagne on the marble floor glows once more in memory, its spill a reminder that joy and sorrow are always bound together. Olive had reached a pinnacle. the role of her lifetime, the moment when her spirit seemed to crystallize into cultural memory. And yet, beyond the lights, her story still unwound, carrying her toward a destiny darker than any audience could have guessed. The image lingers, a film reel slipping free from its projector, the final frame burning softly against the bulb, smoke curling upward as the picture dissolves into silence, while outside the theater, a night wind carries the scent of rain. The final frame smolders in the projector's light, curling into smoke that drifts upward, faint and almost sweet, as though memory itself were dissolving into the air. Outside the theater, a night wind carries the scent of rain across darkened streets, washing posters on the walls until the ink begins to blur. And so the story continues, for even as Olive's triumph in the flapper sealed her name in the public imagination, the shadows gathered more closely around her. For fame, once lit, never rests in balance. It grows brighter and brighter until the darkness that encircles it deepens as well. Hollywood had become a machine of enchantment and appetite. It produced stars as swiftly as it consumed them, raising young faces into symbols, only to whisper about their failings the moment they stumbled. Olive, with her beauty, her independence, and her ties to the tempestuous Jack Pickford, became irresistible material for gossip. The same newspapers that praised her laughter on screen printed rumors of quarrels, of wild nights, of whispered scandals that spilled from private rooms into public imagination. There were tales of extravagant parties where champagne flowed despite prohibition, of quarrels shouted across hotel corridors, of reconciliations as sudden as the quarrels themselves. There were whispers of debts, of jealousies, of scenes so dramatic that even the silver screen could not contain them. Olive's life, lived in the brilliance of fame, became theater itself for a society eager to feast on stories. And yet, beneath the headlines, she remained a young woman trying to navigate the strange terrain of adoration and intrusion. To wake each morning and find her name in print, not for her work but for her private choices, must have left her both weary and resigned. Still, she did not retreat. Instead, she continued forward, appearing at gatherings, laughing, carrying herself with the same charm that had drawn audiences to her. Perhaps she knew that withdrawal would only feed the rumors more. Perhaps she believed that if she kept laughing, the world might laugh with her instead of at her. Jack's presence intensified the drama. Their marriage, bound by passion, was also bound by turmoil. He drank heavily, partied recklessly, and Olive, though independent, was often swept into his storms. Together they seemed to the outside world a pair both magnetic and volatile, lovers who could not exist apart, yet often wounded each other when together. Some whispered that Olive deserved better. Others insisted she was as wild as Jack himself. The truth, as ever, lies somewhere ungraspable, hidden in the privacy of moments long dissolved. But scandal does not require truth. It only requires a willing audience. And Hollywood offered both stage and spectators in abundance. Studios worried over Olive's image even as they profited from her notoriety. Publicists spun stories of reconciliation, of Olive's radiant charm, while columnists hinted at secret feuds and midnight tears. Fame in that era was still a fragile invention. Without the shield of managed publicity, modern stars would later inherit. Every whisper became legend, every stumble became a headline, and Olive, luminous upon the screen, found herself burdened by shadows she could not dispel. There were days when the gossip wounded, days when she withdrew, her laughter dimmed. Yet there were also nights when she rose above it, shimmering in sequined gowns at parties, her spirit unbroken, her mischief intact. To live in contradiction was her nature, both light and shadow, both adored and judged. The question lingers. Did she recognize the danger of such scrutiny? Did she feel that she was being pulled into a current from which there was no escape? Or did she, in her youth, believe she could outdance the shadows, that her charm was enough to silence the murmurs? We cannot know. But we can imagine her stepping into a crowded room, laughter surrounding her, even as her eyes, for a fleeting second, glance toward the corner where the whispers always began. Hollywood was learning in those years that scandal sold as much as beauty. The public craved both, the dazzling smile and the rumor of ruin. Olive embodied this paradox, her films offering joy while her private life fed speculation. She became both the star and the story, the actress and the headline. And in this duality lay the seeds of her tragedy. Still, she continued to work, continued to shine on screen, continued to give audiences the playful spirit they adored. Each performance was a defiance, each laugh a refusal to surrender to the shadows. And yet, behind the laughter, a silence deepened, one that would soon swell into something darker. The smoldering reel fades at last, leaving only the faint scent of burnt film. Outside the theater, newspapers rustle on a bench, their pages dampened by rain, ink smudged but legible, headlines waiting to be read. The stories written there are unfinished, half rumor, half truth, carried away by the wind before anyone can decide which is which. The image remains, a bundle of newspapers left on a wooden bench, the top page blurred by rain, a headline only half visible, promising both admiration and scandal, waiting for a passerby to unfold it in the gray light of morning. The newspapers lie damp upon the bench, their ink smudged by the night's rain, headlines dissolving into gray patterns no longer legible. A passerby glances at them and moves on, leaving the bundle unopened, the stories untold. Yet among those blurred lines rests the weight of countless whispers, stories of laughter, quarrels, reconciliations, triumphs, and shadows. Olive's name, always written in bold type, floated across those pages in equal measure of praise and censure. And so, when the summer of 1920 arrived, she and Jack chose to leave behind the restless eyes of Hollywood, to board a ship bound for Europe, as though distance itself might silence the murmurs and grant them peace. The voyage across the Atlantic was not merely travel, it was escape, a retreat into the wide waters where the horizon erased all boundaries. Ships in those years carried with them an air of ceremony, trunks strapped with leather, promenades filled with laughter, the salty wind whipping through dresses and coats. Olive and Jack boarded with the air of two seeking refuge, yet also adventure. Paris was their destination, the city of lights, the city of lovers, the city where art and decadence intertwined. For a restless pair like them, it promised both enchantment and danger. On deck, Olive would have felt the sea air on her skin, her hair pulled by the wind, her gaze resting on the endless waves. She had left behind the studios, the newspapers, the gossip, and for those days upon the ocean, she was only herself, a woman in her 20s, alive with curiosity, alive with hope. Jack walked beside her, his arm draped carelessly, his laughter carrying across the waves. They posed for photographs, exchanged jokes with fellow travelers, and for a time the turbulence of their marriage seemed smoothed by the vastness of the sea. Yet even as they laughed, a certain heaviness clung to them, for escape does not erase what lives within. Jack's indulgences traveled with him, his love of revelry not diminished by distance. Olive's weariness, too, accompanied her, though she hid it well beneath her brightness. The Atlantic carried them forward, but the shadows that lingered in America were not left behind. They simply sailed beside them, invisible but present. Paris awaited them with its wide boulevards, its cafes alive with conversation, its air scented with wine and tobacco. In 1920, the city was both weary from war and alive with rebirth. Artists filled the streets, music spilled from cabarets, and expatriates mingled with locals in a whirl of languages and laughter. For Olive and Jack, it must have felt intoxicating, a world both foreign and familiar, where anonymity was possible, yet temptation abundant. They checked into the Hotel Ritz, a place of grandeur and comfort, its rooms adorned with elegance, its halls echoing with the footsteps of aristocrats, artists, and dreamers. Olive, stepping into its polished corridors, must have felt both wonder and a faint unease. To live within such beauty was to live also among secrets, for every door concealed stories, untold, some joyous, some tragic. The days in Paris unfolded with dinners, strolls along the Seine, and excursions into the city's vibrant nightlife. Jack, restless as ever, sought out parties, drinks, companions who shared his appetite for excess. Olive, radiant and admired, was never without attention, her presence turning heads in every room she entered. Together they walked the line between love and ruin, their laughter masking tensions that never entirely vanished. In those nights of revelry when music rose from cafes and the glow of lanterns shimmered on wet cobblestones, Olive may have felt again the contradiction of her life. She was adored, admired, enveloped in beauty, yet something elusive lingered beyond her reach. Did she ever pause on a bridge across the Seine, watching the water ripple with moonlight, and wonder if this journey was a beginning or an end? Did she sense that Paris, with all its enchantments, carried within it a destiny darker than she imagined? The newspapers back in America continued to print her name, though she was far across the sea. Columns speculated on her marriage, on her career, on her absence from Hollywood. Some praised her as luminous, others hinted at scandal, but Olive was no longer there to read them. In Paris she walked her own path, unburdened by their ink for a little while. And yet, fate has a way of reaching across oceans, of ensuring that certain stories cannot be left unread. The summer days grew shorter, the nights more intoxicating, and the city itself seemed to lean closer, whispering promises and secrets alike. Olive and Jack, bound by love yet divided by their restless natures, continued their dance of passion and quarrel. To friends they seemed vibrant, alive, the very image of youth. To those who looked more closely, there was a flicker of unease, a shadow behind Olive's smile, a weariness behind Jack's charm. And so the voyage that began as escape became something more complex. Paris was no longer merely a city of light for them. It became the stage upon which their story would find its darkest scene. The hotel corridors, the mirrored halls, the quiet of rooms behind closed doors, all held their breath, waiting. The newspapers upon the bench have long since dissolved in the rain, their blurred headlines unread. But a new headline waits to be written, one that will carry Olive's name not in rumor, but in tragedy, not in laughter, but in silence. The city listens, the river glimmers, the lamps flicker. The image lingers. An open window in a Parisian hotel room, sheer curtains stirring in the night breeze, while the distant bells of the city toll softly, carrying their sound across the rooftops like a warning no one can fully hear. The sheer curtains lift and fall in the night breeze, pale fabric stirring softly like the wings of some restless bird, while the bells of Paris toll from distant towers. Beneath that quiet music, in the Hotel Ritz, a story reached its final turning. The summer had been filled with laughter, quarrels, reconciliations, and nights that glittered with excess. Yet now all of that seemed to narrow into a single moment, a single room, a single breath. For it was on the night of September 5th, 1920, that Olive's life, so radiant and brief, slipped toward silence. Accounts vary, as they always do when truth passes through many hands. Some say Olive returned to her room after a night of revelry, weary and restless, her head heavy with wine and her heart unsettled by quarrel. Others claim she moved lightly, playful even in fatigue, reaching for a glass in dim light without thought of consequence. What is certain is that upon a table stood a vial, small, ordinary yet deadly, a container of mercury bichloride tablets, meant not for indulgence but for Jack's medical treatment. In the shadows of the room, the glass caught the faint gleam of a lamp, and Olive, whether by mistake or by some darker impulse, drank from it. The silence that followed was not the stillness of sleep, but the sharp weight of poison. Her body, radiant hours earlier, was seized by pain. Jack, startled from his own weariness, rushed to her side, and in that moment of terror, the careless laughter of the past seemed to vanish forever. The hotel corridors, so often echoing with the soft tread of wealthy guests, filled with hurried footsteps. Doors opened, whispers rose, and the night grew heavy with the knowledge that something irreversible had occurred. Olive was taken to the American Hospital of Paris, her body racked by convulsions, her skin pale, her lips faintly blue. Doctors worked with desperate hands, but mercury bichloride was merciless. Even in the modern hospitals of the city, there was little hope once such poison coursed through the blood. Jack remained near her, frantic, his charm and laughter shattered into helplessness. He who had so often carried himself with the air of careless youth now found himself facing the abyss of loss. For several days she lingered, suspended between life and death, her body frail, her breath shallow. The newspapers, learning swiftly of the tragedy, spread the story with breathless haste. Headlines screamed across the Atlantic, carrying the news to America where readers gasped, disbelieved, and speculated. Was it accident? Was it despair? Was it something darker, whispered between lovers? The public, insatiable in its hunger for stories, devoured every detail, even as Olive herself lay fading in a foreign land. In the hospital room, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic, of flowers left by friends, of the unspoken dread that hovered like a shadow in every corner. Olive, her once luminous eyes clouded with suffering, may have glimpsed faces leaning close, may have heard voices urging her to fight, but the poison was stronger than their hopes. On the morning of September 10th, she succumbed, her brief life extinguished at only 25 years of age. The city outside did not pause. The Seine still carried its waters beneath the bridges. Cafe doors still opened to patrons, bells still tolled from their towers. Yet within that hospital, within the hearts of those who had loved her, the world fell into silence. Jack, stricken and inconsolable, was left with grief and guilt that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Pickford family, always careful of their public image, now found themselves entwined with a scandal that could not be untangled. And still, the questions began. Was it an accident? An innocent mistake made in dim light? Was it despair? A sudden decision born of fatigue and turbulence? Or was there something hidden, something darker that would never be revealed? No definitive answer was given, and perhaps that was the cruelest part. For uncertainty allows endless speculation, and speculation becomes myth. Olive's death, tragic enough in its reality, became a canvas for every imagination, every suspicion, every fear. Across the ocean, America mourned. Fans who had laughed with her in theaters now wept, staring at photographs printed in black-bordered columns. Fellow actors spoke of her charm, her kindness, her brightness. Some whispered that she had always seemed too radiant to remain long, that her life had burned with a speed that could not last. Others shook their heads at the cruelty of fate, that one so young, so full of promise, should vanish in such a manner. But Olive's story did not vanish. If anything, her death fixed her more firmly in memory. She was no longer simply an actress, no longer simply a flapper upon the screen. She became something more elusive, a legend, a ghostly figure who lingered in whispers, her image frozen forever in youth, her fate unresolved. The ambiguity of her final hours ensured that her story would be told and retold, embroidered with every retelling, until truth and legend were indistinguishable. The open window in her Paris hotel remains in imagination, curtains stirring in the night breeze, as though carrying her spirit out into the city. The bells toll still, each chime echoing with a sense of unfinishedness, a reminder that some stories resist conclusion. Olive Thomas, luminous in life, became in death a figure half real, half spectral, forever wandering between applause and silence. The image lingers, the ticking of a clock in a quiet hospital ward, its hands moving steadily forward, marking time even as one young life slipped away, leaving behind only shadows and questions. The clock in the hospital ward ticked steadily, its hands moving without hesitation, indifferent to the weight of the moment. Each soft sound marked time pressing forward, even as Olive's life slipped away into silence. Outside, the bells of Paris tolled their ordinary chimes, unaware that a star had fallen, unaware that an age had lost one of its brightest figures. Death comes quietly, even to the most luminous. It does not pause for applause or wait for the curtain call. It enters with the same stillness in Paris as it does in any quiet village, leaving those who remain with only questions and grief. Jack, broken and unmoored, stood by her side until the end. His grief was said to be immense, though already there were murmurs in hotel corridors and newspaper offices. Words spread quickly in a city of whispers. What had truly happened in that room? What had passed between husband and wife before the glass was lifted? Truth, already fragile, began to scatter like ash in the wind. But amid all the speculation, one fact could not be denied. Olive was gone, and the body that had once danced beneath chandeliers and laughed before cameras now lay still. Her remains were sent home, across the Atlantic once more, though now not as a traveler eager for Parisian nights, but as a beloved figure returning in silence. The voyage, marked by solemnity, carried with it both sorrow and spectacle, for the newspapers had ensured that Olive's death was no private affair. By the time her coffin arrived in New York, the city was waiting. The funeral was held with a grandeur befitting her fame. Crowds gathered, lining the streets, their faces solemn beneath hats and veils, drawn not only by admiration but also by curiosity. For in the spectacle of mourning there is always an element of theater, and Olive's farewell was no exception. Flowers surrounded her, lilies and roses filling the air with their heavy sweetness, masking the scent of grief with perfume. Photographers stood at the edges, capturing the procession, their cameras clicking in the hushed atmosphere. Friends from the stage and screen spoke of her radiance, her generosity, her laughter that seemed to carry sunshine into even the most weary days. Fellow Ziegfeld girls remembered her mischief, her ability to soften tempers backstage with a single smile. Film companions recalled her ease before the camera, the way her eyes carried meaning without words. Yet beneath the tributes ran an undercurrent of something less noble. The same curiosity that had feasted on rumors of her life now feasted on the manner of her death. The mourners who stood along the streets came not only to honor, but also to see, to be part of the event, to fold the memory of her passing into their own lives. Some whispered in grief, others in speculation. Was it accident? Was it despair? Was it something darker? The very questions that had haunted Paris now hovered in New York, unanswerable yet irresistible. And Olive, silent now, could not speak to defend herself. It is a peculiar cruelty of fame that death often enlarges the spectacle rather than stills it. Olive's life had been one of performance, and now her death became another kind of performance, staged upon the streets of New York, carried in the pages of every newspaper, whispered in every parlor. The same audiences who had laughed at her on screen now stared at her coffin, their admiration mingled with a hunger for story. And yet, amid the spectacle, there was genuine sorrow. Friends who had known her closely wept without reserve, mourning not the legend, but the woman who had been their companion, their confidant, their source of light. For Olive, despite her fame, was remembered by those who loved her as warm, playful, and kind, qualities no rumor could diminish. In their memories, she was not a headline, but a presence, vivid and irreplaceable. As the service ended and the coffin was carried away, the air was filled with silence, broken only by the rustle of clothing, the faint sound of footsteps, the heavy fragrance of flowers. Above, the sky was overcast, gray light pressing down upon the city, as though even the heavens had dimmed in mourning. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave, reluctant to let go of the story that had bound them together in that moment. Yet death, once acknowledged, moves swiftly into myth. Already by the evening of her funeral, papers printed more speculation, more theories, more contradictions. Olive's life, so brief, was being rewritten in countless versions, each tailored to satisfy the hunger of readers. The actress, the flapper, the scandalous beauty, the tragic victim, each title was laid upon her, overlapping, obscuring, until the real Olive seemed ever more elusive. And perhaps that is the fate of those who die young, especially in the light of fame. They become stories, and stories shift with each telling. Olive Thomas, who had once laughed so freely, was now a legend, her life and death a mirror in which society glimpsed its own fascination with beauty, youth, and ruin. The coffin lowered into the earth was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something stranger, a life lived in memory, in rumor, in ghostly persistence. The image lingers, a single white lily left upon the grave, its petals already beginning to wilt, bowing under their own weight, while the city beyond continues to stir with voices, footsteps, and the unending appetite of the living. The lily bows gently beneath its own weight, its white petals beginning to curl at the edges, as though even in death it carries the burden of time. Rain threatens in the distance, a gray heaviness gathering above the city, and those who pause at Olive's grave do so in silence, uncertain whether they stand in reverence or in curiosity. Yet beyond the cemetery gates, beyond the fragrance of flowers and the murmurs of prayer, the streets teem with another kind of energy. For the press has already seized the story, and with it comes a storm of speculation that will not subside. Newspapers, eager for drama, printed her name in bold type across front pages, each headline promising answers, each story filled with contradictions. Was it a tragic accident? The wrong bottle lifted in dim light? Was it despair? A sudden decision born from the turbulence of her marriage? Or was there some darker thread whispered in hallways that no one dared state plainly? The absence of certainty only fueled the appetite for rumor, and Olive, who had lived so vividly, was now reimagined in countless versions, each paper crafting its own Olive, its own explanation. Some columns painted her as reckless, a wild flapper whose nights of indulgence had led inevitably to ruin. Others mourned her as innocent, a victim of tragic mischance whose beauty and charm had been cut short by cruel fate. Still others wove intrigue, hinting at quarrels with Jack, at jealousies, at secrets never spoken aloud. In their hunger to explain, they transformed her death into theater, staged not upon the screen, but across the pages of every daily edition. And the public, insatiable, consumed it eagerly. Men and women who had never met her read her story at breakfast tables, discussed it on streetcars, whispered it in parlors. She had become, in death, a figure larger than life, not simply an actress, but a symbol, a cautionary tale, a mystery to be puzzled over. Every new detail, every contradiction, was devoured as though it might finally offer clarity. But clarity never came. Jack, already shattered by grief, found himself at the center of suspicion. His reputation, long marred by indulgence, made him an easy target for blame. Some accused him outright, others hinted at neglect, at cruelty, at a marriage poisoned as surely as Olive's glass. He protested, he wept, he sought to defend her memory and his own name, but the press was merciless. In their hands, he became either villain or tragic lover, depending on the edition, never allowed to be simply a man broken by loss. Mary Pickford, protective of her family and her own carefully polished image, worked to shield Jack, but even her influence could not silence the gossip. Olive's death had touched something deeper in the public imagination, something that refused to be settled by statements or denials. It was not merely the loss of a young star. It was the mystery, the uncertainty, the sense that something had slipped through the cracks of understanding. Why is it that when death comes in suddenness, we cannot allow it to remain simple? Why do we insist upon shaping it into narrative, into suspicion, into legend? Perhaps it is because the unknown unsettles us, because the thought that a life might vanish by mere accident feels unbearable. We crave reasons, causes, culprits, anything that restores the illusion of order, and when those are not given, we invent them. Thus, Olive's death became more than an event. It became a mirror of the age itself. The Jazz Age was dawning, filled with speed, excess, and rebellion. To some, her story became a warning against recklessness, a moral tale disguised as tragedy. To others, it was proof that beauty and freedom came at a cost, that those who danced too close to the fire were destined to be consumed. And to still others, it was simply a mystery, a story to be retold in hushed tones, embellished with each telling until truth itself disappeared. Meanwhile, her films remained. Audiences could still see her laughter on the screen, her playful eyes, her mischievous spirit. Yet now every reel carried with it a shadow, for those who watched knew they were watching a ghost, a life already ended, preserved only in flickering light. What once had been joyous now became tinged with melancholy, the laughter edged with silence, the sparkle softened by sorrow. Her legacy, barely formed in life, was cemented in death. She was remembered not only as one of the first flappers on screen, but as Hollywood's first great tragedy, the first star whose death became legend. And legends, unlike lives, do not end. They shift, they grow, they haunt. Olive Thomas would haunt not only the imaginations of her fans, but the very places she had walked, the theaters where she had performed, the studios where she had worked. The lily upon her grave bows lower still, its petals falling one by one into the soil, mingling with the earth that now held her. Yet even as the flower fades, her story blooms elsewhere, in newspapers, in whispers, in memory. It will not be buried. It will not be stilled. The image lingers, a bundle of newspapers caught in the wind, their pages torn free, headlines spinning into the sky, scattering across rooftops and chimneys, carrying Olive's name into every corner of the city, carried farther than she herself had ever traveled. The torn pages whirl upward, caught by the restless wind, their headlines fluttering against chimneys and rooftops before drifting slowly down again into alleys and doorways. Olive's name, blurred by smudged ink, settles in places she never walked, carried like a whisper into corners where strangers will glance and wonder. But even as the paper fades, another story takes root, one not printed in columns but told in hushed tones, repeated backstage, murmured in dim corridors, until it becomes part of the city's fabric. For Olive, in death, did not vanish. She lingered, or so they said, haunting the very place where her laughter had first taken flight. The new Amsterdam Theatre, rising tall upon Broadway, had been her home in the days of the Ziegfeld Follies. Its golden arches, velvet seats, and vast stage had framed her earliest steps into stardom, and within its walls her presence had shone brightest. Yet after her death, performers began to speak of her return. Stagehands lingering after rehearsals claimed to glimpse her figure in the shadows of the balcony, a woman in shimmering costume, watching silently as though the show were still her own. Others whispered of a reflection in mirrors backstage, a face familiar yet ghostly, vanishing when looked at directly. Stories grew slowly, as all ghost stories do, nourished not by proof but by the quiet certainty of those who felt a chill in the air, a sudden shift in silence, the faintest scent of violets when no flowers were near. Some insisted she was playful, as she had been in life, her presence light rather than menacing, a trickster spirit who tugged at costumes or flickered the lights just before a show began. Others swore she lingered out of sorrow, unable to release herself from the stage that had both blessed and burdened her. Why do some names dissolve quietly into history, while others return to walk its corridors long after death? Perhaps it is the manner of passing, sudden and unresolved, leaving questions that time refuses to answer. Perhaps it is the strength of memory, the way Olive had embodied not merely a role, but an era's restless spirit, too bright to be extinguished completely. Or perhaps it is that certain lives, lived with such intensity, leave behind an imprint too deep to fade. Theaters are places already alive with ghosts. Each performance leaves behind echoes. Each laugh and sigh from an audience lingers in the velvet and wood, waiting to be stirred again. To those who believe, Olive's presence was simply part of this greater haunting, a spirit woven into the fabric of Broadway. Yet even skeptics, sitting alone in the dim hush of the new Amsterdam, admitted to feeling something. A shift in the air, a sense of eyes upon them, a memory that was not their own. In these tales, Olive transformed again. She was no longer the flapper of the screen nor the scandal of the headlines. She became Hollywood's first ghost, a figure whose charm and mystery outlasted the body. And strangely, the stories were not spoken with fear, but with affection. To encounter Olive's spirit was to be touched by history, to glimpse the flicker of a bygone age. There is something deeply human in this, the desire to believe that those we admire do not simply vanish, that their laughter echoes still, that their spirit lingers where they once found joy. In Olive's case, the idea of haunting seemed almost inevitable. Her life had been filled with light and shadow, her death unresolved, her image preserved in flickering reels. It was as if she herself had already been half ghost while alive, moving between reality and invention, presence and projection. And so her legend deepened. Tour guides spoke of her. Actors, rehearsing late at night, invoked her name with a smile. Stagehands swore they had felt her brush past. Each retelling wove the story tighter, until Olive Thomas became not only a memory, but a presence. One of the first to remind Hollywood that its stars, though mortal, could achieve a kind of immortality through rumor, film, and ghostly persistence. What does it mean for a spirit to be remembered this way? Not in solemnity, but in whispers of playful haunting. Perhaps it means that Olive, even in death, remained true to herself, a figure of mischief and charm, unwilling to fade quietly into the past. Or perhaps it is we who refuse to let her go, unwilling to accept that beauty and vitality can vanish so suddenly, so completely. By imagining her ghost, we keep her alive, suspended between worlds, forever youthful, forever radiant. The torn newspaper pages, carried away by wind, settle now in silence, but within the theater another page seems always open, its story retold with each flicker of light, each creak of floorboard, each whisper in the wings. Olive's presence, whether real or imagined, binds the living to the past, reminding them that the stage never truly empties, that every spotlight leaves a trace. The image lingers. The hush of the theater after midnight, rows of velvet seats empty, stage lights dim to a faint glow. In the silence, a soft creak echoes from the boards, and for a fleeting instant a figure in shimmering costume seems to stand in the wings, watching, waiting, smiling faintly before dissolving into the dark. The hush of the theater holds steady after midnight, the stage faintly glowing as though reluctant to yield entirely to the dark. In that moment of silence, when shadows deepen and every sound feels amplified, it is easy to imagine a figure waiting in the wings, smiling faintly before fading into nothing. Yet Olive's presence is not confined to rumor or whispered tales. She lingers also in the photographs and reels that survive, frozen forever in moments of youth, her gaze unchanging while the decades around her shift and vanish. The camera had loved her in life, and in death it preserved her with an intimacy that feels almost uncanny. Photographs from her Ziegfeld days show her adorned in feathers and sequins, her eyes playful, her lips curved in a smile that seems both innocent and knowing. Studio portraits capture her in softer light, her features arranged with the precision demanded of publicity. Yet behind the formality, her spirit peeks through, vibrant, alive. And then there are the stills from her films. Gestures caught mid-motion, expressions animated by laughter or surprise, images that whisper of entire stories hidden in silence. To look at these images now is to be drawn into a paradox. She is present, vividly so, her gaze meeting ours across the years as though no time has passed, and yet she is absent, gone since 1920, her life cut short in a Parisian hotel. The photographs are both proof of her existence and reminders of her absence, each one a window through which we glimpse a life that can no longer speak for itself. It is this tension that makes them haunting, for they hold her at once too close and too far away. Film adds another layer. Though many reels have been lost, those that remain carry her presence more directly than any written account. There she moves, there she laughs, there she tilts her head with mischief, a spirit caught in celluloid light. Audiences of her time leaned forward in the darkness to share that moment. Audiences now, though fewer, lean forward still, struck by the same vitality. Her silence, imposed by the technology of her era, feels less like absence and more like mystery, as though she withholds her voice deliberately, guarding secrets behind her eyes. What is it in a gaze that so unsettles us when preserved beyond life? Perhaps it is the suggestion of continuity, the illusion that the person still watches, still waits. Olive's eyes, captured by photographers and directors, seem always to meet ours with a brightness that refuses to fade. They are not the eyes of one long dead. They are the eyes of someone just outside the frame, someone who might step into the room at any moment. It is little wonder, then, that her memory grew into ghost stories, for even in her still images, she appears half-spectral, alive, yet unreachable. In these photographs and films, Olive's beauty is undeniable, but it is not beauty alone that captivates. It is vitality, the sense that she is caught mid-laugh, mid-thought, always in the act of living. Even in post-studio portraits, there is often a flicker of playfulness, a refusal to be entirely still. She was, in a sense, always escaping the frame, and it is this quality that lingers, making her more than just an image of a bygone actress. She becomes instead a presence, haunting precisely because she seems unwilling to stay fixed on the page or reel. For those who loved her work, these remnants are treasures. They offer glimpses of a woman who embodied her age, who danced through the early jazz age with boldness and light. But for those who come to her story later, after her death, the images carry an added layer of poignancy. Every smile is a reminder of her brevity, every gesture a reminder of what was lost. In watching her films, one cannot help but feel a trace of sorrow mingled with admiration, for the knowledge of her fate casts a shadow across the screen. And yet, there is also comfort, for Olive is not entirely gone. She exists still, shimmering in those reels, gazing out from those photographs, reminding us that art has the power to resist time's erasures. While the woman herself lies in earth, the image continues to breathe, and in that breath we find both grief and solace. She's both ghost and presence, both absence and return. One might imagine her looking over the shoulder of anyone who studies her portrait now, her playful smile suggesting she knows the effect she has, even from beyond. She was, after all, a performer, accustomed to the gaze of strangers, accustomed to inhabiting both herself and the image others desired. Perhaps, then, she would not be surprised to find herself still watched, still admired, still speculated over more than a century later. The hush of the midnight theater returns, rows of seats empty, stage dimmed. On the screen, her face flickers once more, eyes alive with mischief. The projector hums, the reel spins, and for those moments she is there again, as vivid as when she first stood before the camera. The haunting lies not in shadows or whispers, but in the persistence of that gaze, which time itself cannot extinguish. The image lingers, a lantern slide left glowing in the dark, its frame illuminated, showing Olive's face frozen mid-laughter, the light steady while the surrounding room dissolves into silence. The lantern slide glows faintly in the dark, Olive's face preserved mid-laughter, a moment of brightness held steady while all else fades into shadow. Around it, the theater lies silent, its rows empty, its stage long cold, yet the image remains, reminding us that certain spirits do not vanish with the turning of years. Olive's presence, once fleeting, had already begun to settle into something larger than her own life. She had become not just a performer, but an emblem, a figure whose charm and rebellion shaped the very image of the decade to come. For if the 1920s became known as the age of the flapper, Olive was among its first heralds. Long before Clara Bow captured audiences as the it girl, before Louise Brooks cut her bob and danced across screens with aloof defiance, Olive had embodied the playful daring of a new generation. She was not alone in this. There were many young women who rejected convention, who laughed at propriety, who chose pleasure and independence over submission. Yet on screen, Olive gave form to that restless energy, showing it to audiences in every town and city, making it visible and irresistible. Her film, The Flapper, crystallized the archetype, but the spirit of the role was present in her long before the camera caught it. She was mischievous in photographs, lighthearted in performance, always just a step beyond the expectations placed upon women of her time. She suggested that joy itself could be a form of rebellion, that laughter could unseat solemnity, that charm could disarm even the harshest critic. And in this way, she carved the path that others would follow, consciously or not. When Clara Bow rose to prominence later in the decade, audiences thrilled to her vitality, her vivacity, her unabashed sexuality cloaked in laughter. But in Olive's eyes, one can already see the first glimmer of that spirit, as though Clara were carrying forward a flame passed quietly, unconsciously, from Olive's brief life. And when Louise Brooks, with her sharp bob and cool detachment, defined another facet of the flapper, one can again sense Olive's shadow, the playful spark that first made rebellion fashionable, first suggested that women could command the screen not as tragic heroines, but as carefree spirits. To call Olive the first flapper is, of course, a simplification, for the flapper was a cultural wave larger than any one person. But she was its earliest face in cinema, its first embodied symbol projected larger than life in darkened theaters. And symbols, once formed, do not vanish. They ripple outward, shaping imagination long after the individual has passed. What does it mean, though, for a person to become an archetype? It is both honor and erasure. For Olive herself, with her private joys and sorrows, her laughter and fatigue, her love and quarrels, becomes lost beneath the image she helped create. She ceases to be simply Olive and becomes instead the flapper, the carefree girl of the jazz age. The complexity of her humanity dissolves into the clarity of the symbol, and yet without the humanity that first embodied it, the symbol could not have been born. It is a paradox, and Olive is caught forever in its web. The lantern slide glows, her face luminous, but we know she cannot step from it to correct the simplification, to tell her own story in her own words. We know only fragments. whispered accounts, photographs, films, rumors, contradictions. From these, the image is pieced together, and the archetype emerges stronger than the person. And perhaps this is why she haunts still, not because of tragedy alone, but because the person within the symbol strains against simplification, reminding us that behind every archetype stands a woman of flesh and blood. The flapper itself became both admired and reviled. To some, she was the embodiment of freedom, the proof that women could shape their own lives, laugh in public, dance through the night. To others, she was frivolous, reckless, even dangerous, a sign that tradition was crumbling. Olive carried that duality before anyone else, admired by audiences yet whispered about in gossip columns, celebrated and condemned in equal measure. In this sense, she lived the contradiction that the flapper would come to represent, a symbol of liberation shadowed by judgment. And perhaps this explains why her story endures. To remember Olive is not only to remember a young actress who died too soon, it is to remember the very moment when modernity itself took the stage, laughing, mischievous, unafraid. She embodied a generation stepping out of the shadows of war and into the brightness of jazz, even if her own music ended too quickly. The lantern slide dims, the image flickers, but the glow remains in memory. Around it, the dark of the theater presses closer, reminding us that all symbols are fragile, dependent upon the willingness of others to keep them alive. Yet Olive's archetype remains, carried forward by those who followed her, remembered by those who whisper her name even now. The image lingers, the faint sound of distant jazz carried on the wind, its rhythm uneven yet irresistible, as though drifting from a room where laughter still echoes, where a figure in sequins still dances, her smile daring the night itself to keep up with her steps. The jazz drifts on the wind, uneven yet insistent, its rhythm carrying laughter from distant rooms, its pulse echoing the heartbeat of an age that longed to forget its sorrows. The Great War had ended, leaving behind scars both visible and hidden, and across the world a generation sought to drown memory in motion, in sound, in speed. Automobiles roared across city streets, radios began to hum with music, young men and women crowded into speakeasies where prohibition was defied with every glass lifted. The world was in a hurry, restless to live, impatient with silence. And within this rush of energy, Olive's story took on meaning larger than her own, for she had embodied not only herself, but the very rhythm of her time. Her laughter, quick and mischievous, echoed the syncopation of jazz, breaking patterns startling with sudden shifts. Her defiance of convention mirrored the rebellion of women who bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, and stepped into freedoms their mothers had been denied. Her presence on screen was light, playful, unwilling to be bound by solemnity, just as her age sought to escape the heaviness of grief with dances that lasted until dawn. Yet the jazz age was not only liberation. Beneath the glitter and rhythm lay a hunger that was never satisfied. Every laugh needed to be louder, every party more dazzling, every night longer than the one before. Excess became the rule, and with it came fragility. Lives burned quickly, and tragedies multiplied in the shadows of bright lights. Olive's fate, though singular, became emblematic of this truth, that speed and brilliance often carry within them the seeds of collapse. Her story was told and retold as the decade advanced. To some, she was a caution, proof that beauty and freedom led inevitably to ruin. To others, she was a martyr of modernity, a woman too bright for the world she inhabited. And to many more, she was simply a reminder of how swiftly joy could be extinguished, how fragile the pursuit of happiness could become. In all these versions, Olive's life was used to explain the contradictions of the age, whether to warn, to celebrate, or to mourn. One can almost imagine her spirit walking through the very speakeasies that defined the 1920s, unnoticed by dancers, her sequined dress shimmering faintly in the dim light. She would see the same laughter, the same excess, the same restlessness that had carried her, and perhaps she would smile, recognizing that the world was continuing the dance she had helped begin, even if her own steps had ended too soon. The 1920s were called roaring, yet within the roar was always a whisper of unease. The prosperity, the glamour, the defiance, all were fragile, built on surfaces that could crack without warning. Olive's death had already foreshadowed that fragility. The flapper was both celebrated and condemned, and so too was the decade itself, admired for its vitality, yet judged for its recklessness. In Olive, the paradox condensed. She was the laughter and the sorrow, the speed and the stillness, the promise and the peril. Why does her story linger more vividly than so many others? Perhaps because it crystallized the very essence of the jazz age in a single life. She embodied freedom, excess, scandal, beauty, joy, and tragedy, all in the span of 25 years. She was both the dream and the warning, both the music and the silence after. Her life suggested that to live too brightly was to risk vanishing altogether, yet it also proved that brightness, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Even today, when her films are rarely shown and her name is spoken softly compared to others of her era, Olive remains a symbol for those who look more closely. She is the reminder that the jazz age, for all its energy, was filled with ghosts, lives burned too quickly, stories left unfinished. She is the whisper behind the trumpet's blare, the shadow cast by the chandelier's glitter, the silence after the applause. The jazz still drifts, carrying us back to those nights when the world seemed endless and fragile at once. It carries us to hotel rooms where glasses overturned, to theaters where reels burned, to streets where laughter masked unease. Olive, in all of these, is present, not only as herself but as a reflection of her age, its brilliance and its danger bound together. The image lingers, a cigarette left smoldering in a crowded room, its smoke curling upward, fragile and twisting, beautiful in the lamplight yet destined to vanish, leaving behind only the faint scent of something once alive. The cigarette smolders in the ashtray, its thin curl of smoke rising into the dim air, delicate as a thread of silk unraveling in silence. Around it, the room hums with voices and laughter, yet no one notices the last glow at its tip, the way it diminishes second by second until it is gone. So too does an age pass, unnoticed in the very moment of its vanishing. And in that passing, one life becomes the emblem of all the rest. For Olive's story, though brief, seems to hold within it the very pattern of her time, brilliant, restless, unfinished. The smoke drifts upward, dissolving into air, and once again we find ourselves in Paris. The Hotel Ritz stands silent in memory, its mirrored halls echoing with footsteps long gone, its rooms holding secrets no key can open now. The open window stirs with the breeze, curtains lifting and falling as they did that September night when fate leaned close. We return to the corridor where muffled footsteps once hurried, to the room where a glass stood on a table, where chance and choice blurred into mystery. Here the story pauses as it has always paused, unresolved. Was it mistake? Was it despair? Was it quarrel? No single version satisfies, no certainty has ever been found. Perhaps the truth is that life rarely offers clear answers. Perhaps the truth is that we ask too much when we demand clarity from tragedy. What matters in the end is not the cause but the echo, the way her laughter still carries, the way her image still flickers, the way her name still drifts like smoke into conversations more than a century later. Olive Thomas did not live to see the decade she helped shape. She did not hear the full roar of the jazz age, nor witness the rise of those who followed in her path. Yet she remains part of it, inseparable, a spark at its beginning, a reminder of both its promise and its fragility. She was the flapper before the flapper was crowned, the ghost before Hollywood believed in its own hauntings, the woman who became a legend not because of longevity but because of brevity. Her life suggests that time is not measured only in years, but in intensity. 25 years may seem a fleeting span, yet within hers was packed laughter, love, quarrel, triumph, scandal, and sorrow enough to fill many lifetimes. She danced beneath chandeliers, laughed on screen, quarreled in hotel corridors, whispered promises, lifted glasses, pressed her hand against silks, gazed out of windows, and walked streets far from where she was born. To live so swiftly, so brightly, is to leave behind not merely memory, but presence. A presence that lingers long after the body has gone. And so her legend became not simply that of an actress, but of a haunting. The new Amsterdam Theatre still whispers of her. Photographs still hold her gaze. Films still flicker with her light. She is there in the smudged headlines of old newspapers, in the half-burned reels, in the perfume of violets remembered faintly in darkened corridors. She is there in the minds of those who wonder, who ask, who retell. What do we seek when we hold on to such stories? Perhaps reassurance that beauty and laughter are not entirely lost. Perhaps comfort in the thought that those who vanish too soon remain with us in some form, refusing to be silenced. Or perhaps it is simply human longing, that desire to keep alive the names of the young and the radiant, to whisper them again so they do not fall into the abyss of forgetting. The cigarette is ash now, its glow gone, but the scent lingers in the air. The hotel corridor is empty, but footsteps echo faintly as if someone still walks there. The stage is dark, but a figure in sequins flickers for an instant in the wings. Olive Thomas remains, half memory, half presence, her story unending because it resists conclusion. And here, dear listener, we close the circle. We began with Paris, with muffled footsteps and laughter outside the windows, with a sudden stillness that changed everything. We end in Paris again, but not in silence, for her story has been spoken once more, carried across time to reach your ear in this moment. In telling it, we keep her alive. In remembering her, we defy forgetting. If you are listening now, I invite you to reflect on this fragile connection, that you, across distance and years, are part of the same chain of memory that began when Olive first stepped onto a stage, first smiled before a camera, first laughed into the silence of film. You are part of her haunting, not in fear, but in remembrance. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If you wish, leave in the comments where and when you listen, adding your voice to the tapestry of memory that keeps such stories alive. And if you would like to preserve more lives from slipping into shadow, do subscribe to this channel, for in such small gestures, history itself is sustained. The image lingers, a door left slightly ajar in the darkness of a Paris hotel, the faint glow of lamplight spilling through the crack, while the night air carries the sound of distant laughter, fading, fading, until only silence remains.